Picture the Syrian desert, right? It's 53 BC. The Roman legions, which are, some of the most disciplined military forces on the planet at this point, are facing off against the Parthian army at the Battle of Carrhae.
Oh, yeah, a legendary standoff.
Right. So the Romans are locked in their formation, and they're expecting the usual, barrage of arrows and cavalry charges. But right before the slaughter begins, the Parthian generals do something totally unexpected.
They bring out the banners.
Yes, they unfurl these massive, brilliantly colored banners. And Roman historians literally record the legions being completely awestruck. They'd never, ever seen anything like this material.
Because it shimmered in the desert sun, right?
Yeah.
It fluttered in ways that woven wool or linen just simply couldn't.
Exactly. They were looking at Chinese silk.
And it was this moment of, profound culture shock, because the Romans were encountering the end product of a supply chain that stretched, 7,000 miles across the Eurasian landmass?
Yeah, a supply chain they knew absolutely nothing about.
Nothing at all.
And that profound hidden connectivity is our mission for this deep dive. We are unpacking how the ancient world was operating on this massive prototype of globalization.
It really was.
And we are pulling from three incredibly dense, fascinating sources for you today. We've got a comprehensive historical overview from Silk Road Adventures, a really detailed EBSCO research article analyzing the systemic decline of ancient overland trade, and an academic paper from the International Journal of Social Science and Humanity. That one looks at the historical lessons of China's Gansu province.
Yeah, and the value of looking at these sources together is that you start to see the actual mechanics of history. You move beyond treating the past as just the series of isolated empires.
Right, you see the connections.
Exactly. You start recognizing a living, breathing network of trade and ideas that honestly laid the direct groundwork for the reality you live in today.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the most counterintuitive detail in these sources is how this monumental human achievement, this massive network, forged by millions of merchants and monks and warriors, how it actually started.
Right.
Because it wasn't originally built to trade silk at all.
No, far from it, actually. If we examine the political mechanics of 138 BC, the Han Dynasty in China was facing this huge existential threat from nomadic tribes to the north.
The young knew, right.
Yeah, exactly. And their infantry was just getting completely outmaneuvered. So the Chinese emperor sent an envoy, Zhang Qian, on this diplomatic mission into the uncharted territories of the West.
But he wasn't looking for export markets.
No, not at all. He was conducting military procurement, basically. He was looking for a very specific breed of Central Asian cavalry mount found in the Fergana Valley, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan.
The sources call them heavenly horses, which is just the coolest name.
It is a great name.
And the Chinese writers claim they were sired by dragons and that they literally sweated blood. Wait, is that the blood part?
Well, the sweating blood detail is likely a reference to a specific skin parasite that caused superficial bleeding.
Oh, gross. Okay.
Yeah, a bit gross, but the marketing worked, you know? The Han military recognized that these large, powerful mounts could completely shift the balance of power against the nomads.
Right, heavy cavalry.
Exactly. But to acquire thousands of these highly prized animals, China needed a currency that the nomadic and Central Asian breeders actually valued.
They needed something lightweight, easily transportable, and highly exclusive, which was silk.
Precisely. So, by leveraging their absolute monopoly on silk to buy war horses, the Chinese state inadvertently plugged its domestic economy right into the pre-existing, highly lucrative Western trade networks.
And Rome's reaction to this new commodity is just fascinating from an economic perspective, because it wasn't just like aesthetic appreciation. It caused a genuine macroeconomic crisis.
Oh, completely.
We always hear about moralists, like Seneca complaining that sheer silk garments were indecent for Roman women. But the EBSCO research highlights Pliny the Elder, who was essentially diagnosing massive capital flight.
Yeah, Pliny was freaking out.
He really was. He noted that 100 million sesterces were hemorrhaging out of the Roman economy every single year to places like India and China just to pay for luxury goods.
Because Pliny was watching the Roman balance of trade tip precariously. Rome was importing highly expensive consumables and exporting hard currency like gold and silver.
Which is a very modern economic anxiety when you think about it.
It is. It's the classic trade deficit fear. Meanwhile, the economics within China were entirely different. Silk functioned as literal fiat currency there.
Wait, like actual money?
Yeah. Farmers paid their taxes in rolls of silk. The imperial court paid their civil servants in silk. The linguistic impact alone is just staggering.
Really? How so?
Well, 230 of the most common characters in the Mandarin alphabet use the symbol for silk as their root.
Oh, wow. That really shows how baked in it was.
Exactly. Which explains the totally draconian measures the state took to protect its intellectual property. Sericulture, which is a rearing of silkworms, was a state secret protected by the death penalty.
The death penalty just for sharing how to make fabric.
Yeah, and they maintained that monopoly for millennia. Pliny the Elder actually died believing that silk was harvested by, like, scraping a mysterious fuzz off of leaves in remote forests.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
But I always wonder how a monopoly like that actually breaks. Like someone eventually leaks it, right?
Oh, the sources detailed these wild instances of pure corporate espionage.
Yes. The princess story.
Right. In 440 AD, a Chinese princess engaged to a ruler in Khotan hid silkworm eggs inside her intricate bridal headpiece.
Because she knew the border guards wouldn't dare search a royal's hair. That is so smart.
It was brilliant. And then, a century later, you had two Nestorian monks arrive at the court of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian with bamboo walking staves that they had secretly hollowed out.
Just to smuggle the eggs.
Exactly. But, even though those moments of espionage broke the production monopoly, the actual logistics of moving the goods, the whole distribution network, remained firmly in the hands of Central Asian middlemen.
Right, because the Romans rarely went to China, and the Chinese rarely went to Rome.
Exactly. The people actually moving these assets were groups like the Sogdians.
Yeah, and looking at the mechanics of how the Sogdians operated, they functioned remarkably like modern tech venture capitalists.
Okay, how so? That's an interesting comparison.
Well, they weren't just guys with backpacks full of fabric, They were syndicating massive risk. Outfitting a caravan across the Taklamakan Desert is a huge capital expenditure.
Oh, for sure. That desert is brutal.
Right, it's full of blinding sandstorms, extreme temperatures. The name literally translates to, he who goes in never comes out.
A very welcoming place.
Exactly. So the Sogdians pooled their funds, they hired specialized labor like guides and armed guards, and essentially took equity in the successful arrival of the shipment.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Yeah, they built a network so dominant that the Sogdian language became the commercial lingua franca of the entire route.
That is a really accurate framework, actually. They deeply understood the economics of network effects. I mean, they built caravanserai, which were these fortified way stations every 30 miles.
Which is what, about a day's journey for a loaded camel?
Yeah, exactly. So they provided the physical infrastructure that made the risk mathematically viable. And because they moved across the Eurasian landmass purely chasing profit margins, they facilitated something far more significant.
The spread of ideas.
Yes, they accidentally created the infrastructure for the rapid spread of global ideas.
I want to dig into the mechanics of that, actually, because the sources list an incredible array of technology that flowed west. We're talking the wheelbarrow, the spinning wheel, printing, gunpowder, the mechanical clock.
It's a massive list.
But I understand how silk moves, right? You roll it up and put it in a saddlebag. But how does a complex engineering concept, like a mechanical clock or a crossbow, transfer across thousands of miles without instruction manuals?
Well, it transfers through a combination of reverse engineering, merchant observation, and critically, the migration of skilled labor.
Okay, so a merchant buys a thing and takes it apart.
Right. A merchant might buy a novel device in Chang'an, take it apart during the journey to understand its components, and then hire local artisans in Persia to recreate it. But sometimes the transfer of human capital was much more forceful.
Right, which brings us to a specific event in the sources. The Battle of Talis in 751 AD.
A huge turning point.
Yeah. The Abbasid Caliphate defeated the Chinese Tang dynasty forces, and the records indicate they captured Chinese papermakers and took them back to Samarkand as prisoners of war.
Yes, they did.
But I struggle with the scale of this. How does capturing a few artisans in a battle lead to a society-wide shift in Islamic scholarship?
Because it fundamentally altered the economics of knowledge dissemination.
How so?
Well, think about it. Before paper, the Islamic world in Europe relied on parchment or vellum.
Which is made from animal skin, right?
Exactly. So producing a single book required slaughtering an entire herd of sheep. It was prohibitively expensive. But the Chinese artisans knew how to make paper from hemp, rags, and mulberry bark.
Which are incredibly cheap, abundant materials.
Exactly. So the raw materials were suddenly decentralized. The Abbasids established state-sponsored paper mills in Samarkand and later in Baghdad.
Wow.
And once the cost of writing materials plummeted, you saw an absolute explosion of translation movements. Greek, Indian, and Persian texts were translated into Arabic. It fueled a massive scientific boom.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, you had 10th century scholars like Al-Biruni living in modern-day Uzbekistan using complex trigonometry to calculate the radius of the Earth.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and he theorized that it rotated on its axis, all fueled by access to cheap paper.
The sources draw a really sharp contrast here.
Yeah.
Because while Christian Europe was languishing in a period where scientific curiosity was frequently viewed with deep suspicion, Central Asia and the Middle East were experiencing this intellectual flowering.
Yeah, historians often call it a lost enlightenment.
Right, and without that cheap paper facilitating the preservation and expansion of classical knowledge, the European Renaissance centuries later kind of lacks its foundation.
It really does. But, it wasn't just science either. The Silk Road was the primary vector for global religion.
Definitely.
Buddhism traveled out of India and embedded itself deeply into China and Japan. Islam moved eastward, and Christianity moved across Central Asia.
And when those belief systems physically occupy the same trading posts, they started visually blending. Syncretism, basically.
Yeah, syncretism is the perfect word for it.
Like, consider the artistic concept of the halo. We typically associate the halo with Christian saints, right?
Sure, that's the standard image.
But because merchants and monks were carrying illuminated manuscripts and statues along these routes, their visual vocabularies merged. The halo became a common motif across Hindu, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, and Christian art.
It's fascinating how that happens.
Yeah. A Zoroastrian artist paints a sun disk behind a deity. A visiting Buddhist monk likes the visual representation of spiritual radiance, and suddenly the Buddha is depicted with a halo in the caves of Dunhuang.
And that cross-pollination is arguably the highest achievement of the network. But, and this is a bit, but networks are agnostic.
Meaning they don't care what they carry.
Exactly. The infrastructure that moves an illuminated manuscript or a new technology with remarkable efficiency will move a pathogen with that exact same efficiency.
Ah, right. The bubonic plague.
Yeah.
Yersinia pestis.
Yeah. The bacterium hitchhiked in the guts of fleas, which lived on the black rats that infested the grain sacks carried by the caravans.
It's terrifying because we often conceptualize pandemics through the lens of modern globalized travel, like a virus spreading via jet planes in a matter of weeks.
Right.
But the horror of the plague on the Silk Road is that it moved at the speed of a walking camel, village by village, caravanserai by caravanserai.
It was a slow, inexorable wave of death creeping westward over decades.
Just culminating in the 1346 Black Death that eradicated roughly 40% of Europe's population.
It was a devastating biological shock. But if we look closely at the EBSCO analysis of the Silk Road's decline, the plague was merely one stressor in what ultimately became a total cascading systems failure.
Like it didn't just end overnight.
No, the overland network collapsed under the weight of simultaneous environmental, political, and economic crises.
Okay, let's break down those mechanics, starting with the environment, because that surprised me.
Yeah, so over centuries, a slight shift in regional climate patterns caused the mountain glaciers of the Tian Shan and Pamir ranges to recede.
And those glaciers fed the rivers that sustained the desert oases, right?
Exactly. So without stable glacial runoff, the water tables dropped, the caravanserai literally dried up.
Wow.
And if a camel needs water every few days, and a crucial oasis vanishes into the encroaching sand, that entire segment of the route is just severed. The math of the journey breaks down.
And then you combine that environmental degradation with severe political fragmentation. In the late 14th century, the Turco-Mongol conqueror Tamerlane actively destroyed the northern trade routes.
Right. He essentially waged economic warfare.
Yeah, to funnel all overland trade south, straight through his capital of Samarkand, so he could monopolize the taxation.
Which works, centralizing trade works as long as the central authority maintains security. But when Tamerlane died in 1405, his empire shattered into warring factions.
So the security apparatus just vanished.
Poof. Gone. And merchant caravans require state-backed security to function. Once banditry spiked, the risk outpaced the potential profit.
It feels incredibly analogous to a modern global supply chain crisis. Like if a cargo ship blocks the Suez Canal, or if local tariffs suddenly spike in a key manufacturing region, the entire global logistics network has to furiously calculate how to reroute.
That's a great comparison.
And the overland paths became hostile, not just physically, but ideologically too.
Yeah, the centuries of religious tolerance that allowed diverse merchants to coexist kind of just evaporated. The Tang dynasty in China systematically persecuted Buddhists, destroying their temples to confiscate their wealth.
And concurrently, Islamic factions in the western provinces destroyed ancient Buddhist statues.
Exactly. And by the time the Ming dynasty took power, they pursued a fiercely nationalistic policy of isolationism. They actively closed China's Western doors to insulate their cultural identity from foreign influence.
And then we have to factor in the final geopolitical choke point, which is the fall of Constantinople in 1453.
Right.
The Ottoman Turks captured the city, which served as the crucial bridge between Asia and Europe. That didn't stop the trade, obviously, but they levied exorbitant taxes on every ounce of pepper, silk, and spice moving through their territory.
So European merchants are looking at failing infrastructure, violent banditry, and ruinous taxation. The economic incentive to find a workaround becomes overwhelming.
And that overwhelming incentive sparks the age of exploration. European capital shifts from overland ventures to maritime technology.
Yep.
Figures like Prince Henry the Navigator fund the development of the caravel, which is a ship capable of surviving the open ocean. And by 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama successfully navigates around the southern tip of Africa, crosses the Indian Ocean, and reaches India.
And the EBSICO research notes a really profound paradox here. We usually think Europeans took to the sea because the Silk Road was already dead. But the sea route was actually the primary mechanism that killed it.
Wait, really? The sea route caused the final collapse.
Yeah, the economics are completely undeniable. A single Portuguese galleon could carry the cargo equivalent of 1,000 camels.
1,000, wow.
Yeah, and maritime shipping required fewer guards, no caravanserai fees, no animal feed, and it bypassed the dozens of local warlords demanding tolls. It was infinitely cheaper and faster.
But the cultural cost of that shift was catastrophic.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the era of overland syncretism, where merchants had to negotiate, share languages, and blend cultures just to survive the journey, was replaced by an era of heavily armed maritime monopoly.
It was a brutal shift.
The sources highlight Vasco da Gama's second voyage in 1502. He intercepted a ship called the Mary, which was filled with hundreds of Muslim pilgrims returning from Mecca. And he didn't trade with them.
No, he didn't.
He looted the ship, locked the passages in the hold, and burned it to the waterline. It was this violent shift from cultural exchange to violent colonialism.
And this shift completely redraws the map of global power. Because the oceans became the new highways, Western Europe transformed from a peripheral backwater into the economic center of the world.
While Central Asia got left behind.
Exactly. Central Asia, which had been the beating heart of human commerce and intellectual exchange for 2 millennia, was bypassed and plunged into steep economic decline.
It was just relegated to the margins of history.
Until today.
Right, because the academic paper analyzing the Gansu province records emphasizes the historical rhythm. Openness leads to progress. Closure leads to backwardness. And right now, the lands of the ancient Silk Road are commanding global headlines once again.
Because China is actively applying that historical lesson.
Right.
I mean, since 2013, they have been implementing the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this massive infrastructure project originally estimated at $900 billion.
$900 billion. That's staggering.
It is. They are systematically rebuilding the connective tissue of Eurasia.
So we are seeing the mechanics of the ancient network upgraded for the 21st century. The mud brick caravanserai are being replaced by deep-water ports, 5D networks, and specialized economic zones.
Yeah, and the camel caravans have been replaced by high-speed rail.
Oh, consider the logistics of the Yiwu-Madrid Railway. This blew my mind.
Yeah.
It is a freight line running from the eastern coast of China, straight across Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, Poland, and Germany, terminating in Spain.
And that rail line is incredibly strategic. It provides an option that is significantly cheaper than air freight and much faster than maritime shipping.
Which is huge for supply chains.
Huge. Furthermore, it secures an overland supply chain that cannot easily be blockaded by rival naval forces. As economic forecasts consistently project that nations like China, India, and Japan will dominate global GDP in the coming decades, the balance of power is reverting to its historical norm.
Center of gravity is shifting back to Eurasia.
Exactly.
Understanding the mechanics of the ancient Silk Road isn't just an exercise in history. It really is a critical framework for understanding how the global economy is restructuring itself right now.
It really is.
We've tracked how an ancient Chinese military procurement strategy to buy war horses inadvertently built a 7,000-mile network. And that network functioned as a conduit for paper, complex mechanics, algebra, and the plague.
Yeah, a mixed bag.
Right. And then it suffered a cascading failure due to climate change and political tribalism, forcing the invention of global sea trade. And today, we're watching that exact same geography being wired together once again.
It's cyclical. And it really forces you to reconsider how we categorize these massive systems. In fact, I want to leave you with a piece of context that kind of reframes this entire deep dive.
Okay, let's hear it.
You've spent this time learning the mechanics of what we call the Silk Road, but, you know, the millions of Sogdian merchants, Han soldiers, and Abbasid scholars who built and died on those routes never used that term.
Really? Never.
Never. They had no singular name for the network they were a part of. The term Silk Road, or Seidenstrasse, was completely fabricated by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877.
Wait, 1877?
Yep, centuries after the overland routes had totally collapsed.
So he gave a retroactive label to a reality he never lived.
Exactly, and it makes you wonder. You interact daily with vast, invisible networks of data, globalized supply chains, and algorithmic trade. What grand, defining label will historians in the year 2500 invent to describe the digital and physical networks you are using right now? How will they redefine the reality of your everyday life?